be talking today about financing, what kind of financing is needed, what's out there, and how do you approach a lender. So joining me today we have Rick Lewis, who's an experienced co-op developer. He has also founded the Bay Area Community Land Trust, and he was a key leader with the San Francisco Community Land Trust in its first development. We also have Peggy Jones from the Nehemiah Community Reinvestment Fund, locally here from Sacramento. And she'll also be talking about specifically about the fund's programs and products that you can apply for. So with that, I'll just start us off with, so these are the key topics we're going to be talking about first. What is a developer? What kind of financing do you need? What does the lender want to see? And what are the key challenges? So I'll turn it over to Rick.
We start off here with, we've had a very good background about sort of why we want co-ops, why co-ops are good, how you develop all the legal documents and so on. So we're assuming we're all up to speed sort of there. So who is likely to be developing co-ops? And you know, often it's a group of people. Maybe you live in a building and you understand it's for rent and you say, gosh, we want to try and preserve our building. Most commonly it is a nonprofit corporation that sort of specializes in creating permanently affordable home ownership. And as Tracy pointed out, the Community Land Trust is a model that works particularly well for this. It could also be a city. Sometimes there is existing rental housing that the city really is trying to create home ownership opportunities. So you start off and you think, okay, what kind of funding do we need? There's almost any development is going to need both your short-term and long-term funding. You start with pre-development, acquisition, construction, often even a bridge loan because some of your funding doesn't come in until the project is done. Then the critical part that, you know, again, Margaret talked about is your permanent blanket mortgage and your share loans. So you go to the lender, and I thank Peggy for stressing the first point here, concept. Make sure that you really know what you're talking about. Then the track record, financing needs, and so on. Why are you doing this co-op? You know, who is it going to serve? And how does the model work? So if you're going to serve seniors, you're probably looking at studio or one-bedroom apartments. If you're serving families, you know, 2-3 bedroom apartments. Be really clear, express yourself very clearly. If you're doing a conversion, you better get most of the people who are living in that project to sign on to it. If it's a new construction, you probably need to do some amount of a market study, or again, if you're working with a nonprofit that does co-ops, they may very well have a whole waiting list of people who have indicated that they're interested. But the lender wants to know, you know, are people going to move in once you've got this project done? Then, of course, they're going to look at the developer's track record. And this, again, is why an individual or a group that wants to buy their home is often going to have a much more difficult time. They really don't have a track record. They don't have the development experience. So if you are a group that wants to buy your home, you probably want to seek out this type of nonprofit developer who will really bring that credibility. The team is probably going to be made up of, you know, a project manager, an attorney, very possibly a contractor if you are that far along, an architect. And the stronger the team that you bring in, the better it is that the lender is going to see how serious you are about this. And then, of course, the financial capacity. If your developer has other properties, lenders usually want to see some kind of collateral to guarantee their investment. And this is particularly, I think, in the earlier stages when it's not guaranteed the project's going to be done. The permanent lender knows what they're getting, but it's in the earlier stage where that's particularly important. Now, the project that Tracy referred to, the San Francisco Community Land Trust, we actually would, this is a case where we would encourage and the lender to have some flexibility. This was actually the first project that the San Francisco Community Land Trust did. It ended up a $8 million project. But we put together a very strong team that included Karen Tiedemann as our co-op attorney and other people with a lot of experience. And we also brought in tremendous community support and a lot of support from the city, both financial and policy support. So the lender was willing to sort of extend their normal policies in order to consider our project. So it becomes a whole package of what the development team is. So again, when you go into the lender, be clear about the type of funds you're looking for. Never hurts to research to see. Some lenders only give short-term money. You know, that upfront money doesn't do long-term. So be as clear as you can be beforehand. We're going to do a quick view of the budget. This is kind of the financial feasibility part. We're going to look at just, again, the development budget has sources and uses, and the loan to value, we'll talk about that in a minute. The operating pro forma has income and expenses. Usually over 20 years, our budget just shows 1 year because we didn't want to run on 6 pages. Debt coverage ratio and reserves. So we'll look at those briefly. The debt coverage ratio, and this is again one of the critical terms, you're going to get a lot of acronyms, but the DCR, you take the net operating income, in this case $102,000. Just below that, you'll see the debt service on the first mortgage, $88,600. So looking back at the slide, you divide the net operating income by the total debt service, and most lenders are going to want somewhere around 1.15 debt coverage ratio. Some want higher, 1.2. Others are willing to consider something lower. Now that we're looking at the operating income, we'll just go over, the operating budget. We'll go over a few points quickly. Because the lender is going to want to make sure that you have sufficient income to cover all of your expenses. So income is traditionally, it's largely your carrying charges. It's also been referred to as the monthly assessment. It's effectively the equivalent of a rent. But then most lenders, again, are going to expect, they're going to just assume that you're having a vacancy. So we put in 5%. Some lenders expect something higher, but co-ops typically have lower vacancy rates than standard rental. So 5% is a pretty safe number. Then the next section is all kind of standard expenses. They're in sort of condensed categories. Again, a lender may want much more detail, but this gives you a quick view of your income, expenses, and so on.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Just, from my understanding, what I've heard so far is that the net operating income can sometimes be flexible because the cooperative members have certain, they have to cover the costs. Is that right?
When you call flexible?
In terms of like, it may vary from month to month, the amount of money that the cooperative members.
No, a co-op board would approve an annual budget. And sure, one month you may pay a little bit more for utilities or something, but you look at an annual budget. And the only time it would be adjusted, unless there was something significant that changed, would be on an annual basis. And you would have costs gone up enough that we need to increase the carrying charges, or is it sufficient to?
And that's what I mean, in that the net operating income does have a level of responsiveness to the needs built into it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then on the other side of this ratio, you have this 1.15. That's after all of your expenses. That means.
Correct.
And so where does that money go? This 0.15, is that returned to the co-op?
Well, the .1, or the one here goes to the lender. What you end up
Right.
with is 15% over.
And where does that?
Well, the lender wants to be sure that when you've paid all the expenses, that you've got more than enough to pay the mortgage.
Right.
If you have a 1.0, that means you've paid all your expenses, you pay the mortgage, and you've got zero left in your
Right,
bank account.
there's no slot limit.
Right.
But in reality,
Where
when
does
you
it go?
have a situation like that, what do
Well,
you do with that extra
if
money?
if you look at the very bottom of that operating pro forma, and we'll get to this in a minute, but often you'll get a second mortgage, and that second mortgage is going to expect 50% of the cash flow to go to pay for that. We'll get to that in a minute, but like a city will often provide a second mortgage. The payments are only due out of 50% of the cash flow. And ultimately, if there's a little bit left, what we do with most of our co-ops is we say it goes into your replacement reserves, because very often that's, no matter how much you say you're going to put in, there's never quite enough to do it. So it doesn't go back to the members as a dividend. It could affect, if you really do well on your budget, you could at least say there's no rent increase this year. Or in theory, I've never heard of it, you actually lower your rent. You're much better off just saying, for the foreseeable future, there will be no rent increases because we've got a lot of surplus. Doesn't happen very often. That money finds a way of getting spent. Anyway, I'm going to keep on going here. This is on the development side, and Margaret had shown this slide earlier. This is the broad overview. Again, when you go into the lender, you have to understand that you've got a number of sources. So usually the biggest chunk is going to be your blanket mortgage. And this is where the other key formula comes up, the loan to value. Most lenders have a limit. It's hard to tell, but I would say most typically it's between 60 and 70%. Some told us they were willing to go as high as 80%. So, but the lower that is, the less the risk to the lender, the less percentage that they've invested in there, and the greater probability, since they're the first mortgage, if there should ever be a default, they get their money back first. So in this case, you would take the appraised value of the property, and you take the total loan amount and you divide it by the appraised value of the property. In this case, we're assuming the total development cost is actually the appraised value. It's not always going to work that way. If you buy the property below market, you might actually, the appraised value may be higher than your total development, or it could be lower. But for convenience sake, we took our mortgage, which is 1.2 million, divided it by the total value of the property of 1.9 million. We end up with 65% of the development costs coming through there. But then you have a big chunk to fill in. Typically, and this is what I was talking about before, you may go to the city or county or other program that's willing to take a second position. That means, in that worst case, if there's a default, they get their money second. And that's usually only going to be a public agency that's willing to do that. In this case, we're assuming, and again, you can kind of follow this on the other side with the our development budget, or what's called sources and uses. At the top, you'll see the permanent sources, $1.2 million permanent loan, then the city's second mortgage of $380,000. So we're just assuming here that it might be 20%. Now, in the project we did in San Francisco, it was substantially more. The city put in probably over 50% of the actual development costs, because it was a seismic retrofit building, and they had a particular source to make buildings seismically safe. So in that project, we were able to make it affordable to people at 40% of median income. That's very difficult to do normally for a co-op. you get a little bit up, and even after you get that city money in there, you still have a gap. Organizations like the Federal Home Loan Bank have a program called the Affordable Housing Program. You can also go after foundation grants, and something that I think Karen had mentioned briefly, there's a new program that allows union and or employers to make investments as well. So you look for whatever sources. These really are grants that don't need to be paid back, as opposed to the second mortgage, which may have deferred payments but do eventually need to be paid back. Then we get to the final, which we usually try and keep the amount that the co-op members have to pay down around 5% to keep it affordable. I mean, we heard some co-ops that were up at $25,000, makes it very, very difficult, or even the one at $10,000. So, but the members have to invest in it. They come up with the savings, share loans. In that handout we gave you, we actually found a number of lenders who are open to making share loans, and that was important. There's a whole series of other potential programs that can help the tenants, the co-op members raise those funds.
I'm going to back up a little bit and talk just a little bit about the affordable housing program that Rick mentioned. This is a competitive grant program that's actually structured more like a forgivable loan, that's what they're called these days, that a intentional cooperative or the developer or the nonprofit helper can apply for this through one of our member banks. I know we have a couple in the room today, so we can talk about that if anyone was interested. I have some materials on the table as well. And this is a 15-year grant for a multifamily development, which would be structured like a rental, on paper. It can also work with home ownership in terms of individual single homes and single shares. And so it's considered gap financing, like Rick was saying. If you have, if your residents are bringing in some equity, and then you can only borrow up to 65 or 70% loan to value on your first mortgage, how are you going to fill that gap? Well, the AHP program is one program that can help you fill the gap as long as you meet the program's guidelines. And that will stay on the property to continue to be a subsidy for future home buyers to buy in. We have another program that's more individual based called WISH, or IDEA, and these are individual down payment assistance grants, and they're forgiven after 5 years, which means the home buyer keeps the money, and it's up to $15,000 towards your purchase share. It's a matching grant, $3 to your $1. So if you come in with $5,000, the bank gives you $15,000. Again, you apply through one of our member banks, and I have information on those on the table over here. So those are ways of trying to help fill that gap between the cost of developing a co-op, your conventional financing, and what the residents can bring to the table. So Rick and I did a survey of lenders in Northern California, and we were able to speak to 22 lenders, and several of them, again, are in the room today. So I'm going to just give a little shout out and say thank you, and I hope that we'll have time after to talk, and if anyone's wanting to talk to a lender, the resources are here today. So we wanted to find out who is lending on co-ops, who is interested in lending on co-ops, and what is the lender's perspective in terms of what are they looking for. And a lender is always looking through the lens of risk, right? They're always, before you give money to someone, you're always thinking, what's the likelihood that they're not going to pay me back? So there's always that perception of risk. So there's a handout in your packets that CCCD put together, and it's their list of housing cooperative lenders, and we just sort of added to that list. And of our survey of 20 lenders, we found that all 20 across the board said the number one thing that they're looking for is the capacity or the track record of the developer. And that means the ability of that developer to complete the physical project, right? So you're not stuck with a short-term construction loan that can't be completed and paid back, but also the financial ability of closing out that short-term loan and securing long-term financing, whether it's through the membership shares the sales of those shares. Is there a market? Are home buyers already in line, ready and committed to buy? And then also your permanent financing. So they pretty much want to know that, you know, it's hard to be the first lender in the deal. And when you're working with community development financial institutions, sometimes they're willing to be the first, but they often even want to see a city agency in committed financially first, just to bring a little stability to your financial capacity, so that they know that there's some other lending agency out there willing to help carry the financial burden, so that when it comes time to close out your construction loan, pay it back, and convert into your long-term mortgage, that there's there's a good team of support. So it's your developer and your other funding agencies together. So number one was definitely the track record of the developer in terms of physical and financial ability. I'd say another big issue that came up with lenders was the ability to sell the shares and secure that permanent financing when the construction or acquisition or rehabilitation was complete. So again, it's about talking to some of the lenders. Some of the lenders will provide a transition loan that goes from construction right into a permanent mortgage financing. So that's always a nice relationship, just to keep that relationship with the lender that you're working with. So thirdly, I guess the future financial feasibility of the project. So even if you've just had a developer helping you with the construction and the initial sales of the shares, what about the future feasibility of what if you do have vacancies, or what if something goes wrong with the roof and something has to be repaired? It's really important to have your operating pro forma right up front, which is usually like a 15-year projection of 15 years of income and expenses, and making sure that you have built in at least a 5% vacancy rate. You got to anticipate that you're going to have vacancies. You anticipate problems. Make sure you have operating reserves. This is a benefit over being just a condominium, where they often don't build in operating reserves to cover any deficits, or if any homeowners have difficulty in paying their monthly payment. You have a reserve fund so that the co-op doesn't hurt because of the individual. So having this spelled out on paper when you go talk to the lender is very important. It paints the financial picture for them. And then finally, the experienced lenders that we spoke to wanted to see a property management plan and a training plan for the co-op board. They wanted to see that right up front. So not just working with a third agency as your developer, but even working with a third-party nonprofit like a community land trust that will help be the scaffolding around the co-op board as they're learning to manage their own property, manage their finances, manage conflict. That will also strengthen the picture for your lenders right up front to want to make that investment financially. So those were our major results. So in sum, what we learned from our survey was ensure you have resident commitment right up front, and that's, you know, the voluntary time and financial commitment. Prepare a clear concept for your project. Put together a credible development team, and prepare careful financial analysis. And just to add on to this, I would say that the key elements in place that should be in place before you start talking to a conventional lender, they wanted to see site control, like having already acquired the property, especially in this market, which means it was either donated or someone already owned it, or maybe you use CDBG city funds to acquire a property. Having a reputable developer across the board, super important. Having your home buyer, residents, owner, member owners already identified and already together as a group. And then finally, the pro forma penciling out. So we were able to just tally up. We found among the lenders on that lender list in your packet, it might be a green list, we found that about 8 of them were willing or able to provide a pre-development loan. That's like your planning phase. About 11 were willing to provide an acquisition loan. About 10 were willing to provide a construction or rehab loan. And about 6 were able to provide a permanent blanket mortgage, so you know that pool gets a lot smaller. And then we only talked to 3 lenders out of those 20 lenders who would be open to providing individual share loans, and that was the National Co-op Bank, North County Co-op Bank, and Chase. was able, because they've worked on the East Coast, they know what co-ops are. So those were the 3 banks we talked to that were able to provide individual share loans.